Hello everyone, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce, as part of the SPS seminar series, Professor of Development Studies at SOAS and author of the recent groundbreaking work, Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, Professor Guy Standing. So, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
As you say, I'm a professor at SOAS, and before that I was a professor in Bath. I'm an economist by training. I have a PhD from Cambridge. And for many years I was in the International Labour Organization, rising to crazily high positions as Director of Labour Market Research, Director of Socioeconomic Security, and I've been coming to terms with the values and the model that the International Labour Organization represented at the international level. And I left there 5 years ago, and since then I've been writing a lot. I've written a book which took me 25 years to articulate and refine, and it's called Work After Globalization. And it's essentially a coming to terms with labourism of the 20th century and thinking that we must reconceptualize what we mean by work in the 21st century. And wherever I went in the world presenting this book, and for some reason I was invited to a lot of places to do so, whenever I was talking about one subject, you could hear a pin drop. And I decided that in fact what I needed to do was to write an approachable narrative about that theme, and the theme is the precariat. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, as you said.
Right. Well, without giving too much away, can you tell us a little bit about the ideas behind the Precariat and the book?
Yes, I mean, the debate starts back in the 1980s, when I joined the ILO. And I read and I wrote some articles in the 1980s saying that governments in the quest for globalization were flexibilizing their labor markets, and as a result were introducing many forms of insecurity for people. And I argued that this would inevitably lead governments to go towards means testing, selectivity, targeting their social benefits, and at the same time there would be a growing fragmentation of our societies and much greater inequality. So I'm not talking in hindsight. These were articles and books I wrote in the 1980s. And for my pains, this was the first time I was thrown out of my ILO position because the employers and the unions objected. The unions said we should not be talking about flexibility. It will not happen. The employers were objecting because I said, look, what you're pushing for is going to produce terrible inequality. And unless there's a strategy for dealing with that inequality and the insecurities, there's going to be a really nasty set of developments. So it started back then, and since then I've been writing boring economics books about how labor markets are developing. And essentially the precariat is the end point of that analysis, because I've been saying that with class fragmentation, class itself would not go away. But what you're seeing is a global class structure that's taking shape. It's still taking shape. We don't quite know exactly how it's going to come out. We have a plutocracy and elite at the top that are earning absurd incomes and have absurd influence on the world. As I say, we know their names. We wish we didn't, because most of them verge on criminality, you know what I mean? A long way below that are the people who've still got salaried jobs and employment security. This was the model of the 20th century that a lot of people thought that was the majority of the future. And below that, the old working class is shrinking away. And that's shrinking away even in India, where I'm working, which is an industrializing country. You don't see the proletariat expanding. And the irony there is that the whole ethos of social democracy, the whole ethos of the welfare state, and the ILO itself was based on that class, was based on the working class. But that's shrinking everywhere, and it's below that that this precariat has been taking shape. And the precariat, when I go into it in detail in these two books, The Work After Globalization and The Precariat, has a set of distinctive characteristics. I'll be discussing that this afternoon, and I won't go into it now, but essentially it's something unique. We've always had precarious workers. We've always had people who are doing precarious labor. There's nothing new in that. It's the fact that the mainstream society wants the mainstream labor force to consist of unstable labor suppliers. People in security who are what I call denizens. People who are supplicants. They don't have rights. They have to beg, in a sense, for entitlements. And most ironically of all, we have a phenomenon where employers, governments, and all sorts of agencies are expecting and wanting people to have an education above what is needed for the labor that they are expected to do. This is unique. Never before have we wanted that sort of phenomenon. And yet, when you have mass unemployment as a result of the crash and the crisis since 2008, I keep hearing politicians and leaders of international agencies, and I heard last week Council of Europe director and the Employment Commissioner saying the answer to this mass unemployment and the insecurity and inequality is more education. When we've got millions of young people with high-level education, with qualifications, languishing in insecurity. This is a ridiculous situation. And I developed the theme in the book that this is the end of a Faustian bargain. And the Faustian bargain was that with global convergence of our market system, wages and benefits would fall in our countries, in Britain, across Europe, in America. And as it did so, the politicians didn't want it to be too quick. So they made a Faustian bargain with you and me and our parents and friends and relatives. The Faustian bargain was said, you can have an orgy of consumption, you can have cheap credit, you can have tax credits that top up your wages that are falling, you can have consumer credit, you can have subsidies to keep up employment and so on. And all the time, of course, you're building up household debt, you're building up corporate debt, you're building up government deficits until the orgy has to come to an end. Like every Faustian bargain, it comes to an end. And that's where we are today. Mm. And I think the last two chapters of the book are where the action is now. Either you're going to have a politics of inferno with populism and neo-fascism, or we need a new progressive politics, which I call a politics of paradise. And for some reason, the book hits some nails on the head, and I'm asked all over the world. I've been to 27 countries and 130 something presentations to different groups and women's groups, unions, NGOs, bureaucracies, even temporary employment agency headquarters. They've invited me to talk about this. It's a theme that hits a lot of people. And a lot of us feel that we are on the edge of being in the precariat if we're not deep in it. And the great thing about 2011, and I was invited to address Occupy movements in the United States and Canada and the Indignado movement and so on, is that now we've suddenly reached the point where more and more people know it. And they're not ashamed. They're not ashamed to say, I know, I am part of the precariat. And you, politicians, establishments, academia, you've got to address our concerns. And I think that's a great new point. That's why I'm optimistic in the medium term, even if there are disgusting things taking place.
Yeah, and I think definitely for people of my generation, that definitely resonates, because we're all looking at graduating in a year or two, and you hear stories about the law graduate who worked at Poundland on a workfare scheme for free, and that's the kind of thing we're faced with. So I think that this book is quite resonant. So what do you think this means for kind of people of my generation? What are the implications?
Well, I think the great thing is that 2011 marked the first stage of what I'm calling a global transformation, with respect to Karl Polanyi's great transformation, and I'm sure all your listeners will know that book. With a global transformation, you have a crisis point, and then you have a new moment where there's a possibility of re-embedding the economic system, which is out of control, in society through new forms of regulation, new forms of redistribution, and new forms of emancipation. That's where we are at the moment, I believe. Doesn't mean it will happen. I am not deterministic. It's saying that unless it happens, we're in for some very bad times. But the first thing that is needed is a sense of recognition that this new emerging class is a class in the making, to the point where each of us can say, I am part of it. That's the first stage for saying that if we need to make major changes, you've got to have a commonality of recognition. And I think that in 2011, with all these upheavals that took place and all the energy in the streets and the squares and so on, it may have been temporarily put back and it didn't lead anywhere, but around the world you've got this tremendous energy, a tremendous sense of the precariat exists. I get invited to, say, southern Italy recently, in Napoli, in the slums of Napoli, and there they have a precariat movement with graffiti on the walls and meetings and the rest of it, and most of those would have voted, I'm afraid, for Grillo and the five-star movement, simply because they know what they're against, but they have not yet see a vision that's on the table that they can vote for. And therefore one should see what's happened in the Italian election as a very important step. I mean, we did predict it, and I work a lot in Italy. We did predict that this would happen, given that your social democrats, your old left of centre, have no clothes. They're emperors without any clothes, which doesn't make them any prettier. But you also have the far right dragging more people to the right politically, with anti-migrant rhetoric, vicious rhetoric, playing on the fears of people, demonizing people, the Roma, the this group, the that group. I warn about that in my book. And these people are again, you saw Berlusconi, this clown of disgusting practices, a man who's a proven crook, and yet he manages to get over 27% of the popular vote and holds the balance of power, possibly. So you're getting a situation where these tensions are taking political directions which, if I was a political scientist student, I would certainly find fascinating from an intellectual point of view. But out in the streets, there's a sense of urgency and energy, which means that all of us owe it to ourselves, our families, our friends, our communities, to become politically active again. A lot of people had disrespect for politicians and the commodification of politics. I share that disgust. But unless we act collectively and demand progressive changes, then we have only ourselves to blame for what happens. And I think we are at that stage, and there's an energy which is exciting. It is exciting, and we have to find ways, all of us, of playing our small part in helping that process. And if my book has any value, I hope that it contributes in that way.
Right. I mean, yeah, you talk about the demonization of different races as being obviously a very divisive tactic, but I also think, you know, there's an issue with the demonization of the working class people. There's a lot of rhetoric around benefits, scroungers, spongers, this sort of thing. I mean, how do you think that can be overcome, and can it be overcome?
It must be overcome. I put it in this way, that with the commodification of politics and with the development of commodified politicians, they're increasingly utilitarian. They want to play to achieve the happiness of the greatest number, at least the majority. So they all try and compete to have the right sound bites and the right posturing for what they perceive as the middle, squeezed or otherwise, right? Or the one nation, or whatever the euphemism might be. So that they are being utilitarian, going for what they perceive as the majority and what their focus groups and others tell them. And as a consequence, they feel quite free to demonize what they see as the minorities, whether it's unemployed, who they can call scroungers, as if that's the relevance. The unemployment doesn't come from individuals. It comes from failed policies and failed structures that produce mass unemployment. And then they turn around and say, you're unemployed, you're lazy, you're a scrounger, etc., etc. And we're going to put you in workfare, and we're going to put you in unpaid positions and call it experience, when it's probably doing the opposite. We should mock all of that rhetoric. And I think it's got to the level where it is close to being depraved. And I'm not talking with lack of experience, because since the book's published, I cannot tell you how many emails and contacts, including some letters, from people who tell me their story. And I could write another book just on the basis of all these accounts. When I was preparing to come here this afternoon, I got 2 more long accounts of what they've had to put up with. I mean, there was the one case yesterday. A woman wrote to me, had a master's degree, I should tell you. She's unemployed, and she's been going to the job centre, and her mother lives in the other part of the country, down south, and she's very sick and she's elderly, and she needed to go and visit her mother for a few days. Guess what's happened? She's had her benefit taken away because she's not available. Well, this is nuts. It's not nuts, it's nasty. And I could tell you dozens and dozens of stories. If you were a politician, you might say, you're exaggerating, but I cannot believe that. I just hear so many people that write to me, talk to me in the meetings I attend. Sometimes it makes you cry. I mean, almost literally. Because you're seeing so much suffering, and at the same time these politicians are presenting the picture as if it's a bunch of scroungers, and us hard-working people are the virtuous. Well, Francois Mitterrand some years ago made a very clever remark when he said, some people make money most when they sleep. And he was referring to the financiers and the people living off shares and interest. Well, that's even worse today. The people who've been gaining out of this huge recession, great recession, call it what you like, have been the financiers. The stock markets, the bonuses are huge. I mean, Wall Street has just issued $24 billion worth of bonuses to its top people. In Britain, we find that Barclays, they've been caught with the LIBOR and they lost their chief executive, but they're churning out over £1 million to 300 or 400 of their staff. £1 million a year. They're not doing too badly. but they're not working as hard as many people are working for very low wages and no benefits and no security at the end of it. So don't let the politicians say that work is the best way out of poverty. We should have short-arm reactions to that. And I think it's about time that even academics should be a little wilder in their anger, their sense of concern, and their sense of ridicule what goes for polite society presentations of what is happening out there. When I hear about scroungers, when there's no evidence that the vast numbers of people are scroungers, and at the same time you hear of vast numbers of corporations and individuals evading and avoiding taxation, please. I mean, we should just shout and throw raspberries at these people. Don't get me on any further.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Guy Standing. Very interesting talking with you. Thank you.